The social movements have always been at the heart of my research for 4 decades. And my interest for social movements is because throughout history, they have always been the levers of social change in the world. The world changes through social movements. They are the institutions of society, they are evolution of the institutions, but ultimately institutions always crystallize, always express the interests and values of those in power, and they come to power by a set of conflicts in which they are winners, always provisional winners. So they create institutions, the institutions consolidate their power and their values, but the societies continue to evolve until new social actors enacting new values and different interests come into the public sphere, contesting the values and interests institutionalized in the state ultimately, but also in the business world, in the media world, etc. And therefore from this interaction results a gradual or fast transformation of the institutions. And this never stops. That's the movement of history. Looks very tiring, but from the human perspective, we have a short span of life. We may have the impression of stability, but in fact, from the historical point of view, stability is not the normal state of societies. Change is. However, change is often underground, is hidden, until suddenly it expresses in a set of social movements, which increasingly are contagious, but always they were in history. Now, one of the important things about social movements is that they emerge throughout history from changes in the mind of the people. And these changes in the mind of the people are largely dependent on processes of communication. Because otherwise, how people would get the ideas only by themselves, even if they get it by themselves, they need to receive and interact with others. Be it, the preachers from religious leaders in the churches or in the temples, to the word of mouth, to pamphlets. Communication has always been at the heart of the process of changing of mind, which has been at the heart of the process of transformation of institutions. That's why throughout history, tyrants used to burn books or to eliminate the capacity for alternative leaders to express their views. And therefore, it's almost like a precondition for anything to change, anything to happen, to build up autonomous forms of communication through which ideas that are considered to be different, subversive, challenging, spread throughout the minds of the people and ultimately reach a critical mass in which they challenge the powers that be. That critical mass and that moment of challenge is what we call social movements. Social movements are not political movements, although they had huge political consequences in most cases in the long term, and sometimes in the short term. Social movements are not political movements in the sense, at least in my own definition, or in the definition of Alain Touraine, from where I learned to study social movement. And the social movements, political movements, aim at the transformation of the institutions of the state, of the power systems as institutionalized. Social movements aim at changing the values of society, the culture of society, the cultures that are predominant. The most direct example that we can have in recent history is the women's movement, that in the last, in many different ways, in many different countries, in the last 4 decades, has basically changed the way women in the world think about themselves. And the way women think about themselves changes everything. literally everything, and that's what we are observing throughout the world. So that's a typical case in which was not necessarily a political women party. Then there are a number of women political projects, but that's a different thing. The fundamental change happened in the minds of women and through the minds of women in society at large. So that's why I always was focusing with particular interest on the formation, evolution, and social outcomes of social movements. Now, starting empirically, and then I will try to elaborate in terms of my research. What I could observe easily that since 2009, starting in fact with Iran, there had been a number of increasingly important social movements around the world challenging the powers that be and the institution of society in a very different new form in terms of the way of organizing, communicating, and acting. Not in terms of being non-institutional, because most social movements in history had not been institutional, and they had always been emotional. Social movements are emotional. They start from the emotions of human life, when people cannot take it anymore, when it's outrage. That's the title of my book. From outrage in the Spanish self-declared name, indignation, social movements come into the forefront of societies, taking risk. The participants in social movement know that they're taking big risks. They can be arrested, beaten, killed, banned, stigmatized from society, and still they do it. Why they do it? Because they cannot take it anymore. And in fact, this connects with a debate in social sciences and in policy about what is important for human beings, and what is shown by survey after survey and study after study. What is important for human beings, fundamentally, more than food, more than anything else, is dignity. Their dignity. That's the Amartya Sen theory of development. Development as dignity. And when your dignity as a person, it's humiliated, rejected, not recognized, then people become indignant. So all these movements come from indignation. And in the case of the Spanish movement, they adopted this name, but then all other movements. And in fact, if we look at all these movements around the world, it's interesting. The same word in Arabic, in English, in Spanish, in Portuguese, with no previous connection, the same word repeats in all these movements spontaneously. The same, literally, the same word, dignity. So, therefore, it's something to be considered as the lever of social change in our world. Let me go very quickly about what these movements had been empirically, and then my lecture will consist basically in two operations. One, I will try to summarize for you what I have found through my research and the research of my collaborators and my whole network of people working on this and working together with me in these matters, which are the common trends of all these movements. All these movements have common trends, some fundamental common trends. And here's my point. If movements coming from very different sources, very different reasons, in very different contexts, development and underdevelopment, growth and crisis, extremely different cultures, if they do have some common trends, there is something new going on. There is a historical subject that is emerging beyond the traditional forms of organizing social change. And that's my research. My research is exploring the contours and the dynamics of this emerging historical and social subject. The other part of the lecture, I will try to address quickly the question that everybody is asking around the world about this movement, what I call the so what question. They propose what, which are the impact on on power, are they making any difference other than being a few kids playing with social change? Well, I want to address this question, so I will not give you yet my answer so that you can stay a little bit longer in the lecture. Remember, in terms of simply these movements since 2009, they had been literally a wave of social movements in over 100 countries, in thousands and thousands of cities. Only in the United States, against the image that the United States social movements have not been very popular lately, between September 2011 and May 2012, over 1,000 American cities, United States cities, have movements of occupation. For some time, with different intensity, etc. Over 1,000 just in the United States. And of course, everybody remembers the so-called Arab Spring that in fact started in December in Tunisia in 2010, and then the whole wave, and then Egypt, then Syria, etc. Well, I will deal later with the impacts or non-impacts of these movements, but in terms of the intensity, the Arab world changed dramatically in a few months, for good or for bad, then it's subjective opinions. But the Arab world, pre and after these movements, has nothing to do with in terms of the cultural, political, social situation. Then in Europe, in relationship to the economic crisis, and Iceland was the first one, and was a total transformation of this little tiny society, but it started the revolution in Europe. Throughout Europe, the movements were starting in 2011 with the idea Iceland is the solution, as the Egyptian movement started with Tunisia is the solution. So they were connecting with each other. Greece in 2010, and of course the so-called Indignadas movement in Spain started in May 2011 and still continuing all the way until now. For those of you who know Spanish, I said Indignadas, which is the feminine, because that's how the movement calls itself. It calls itself in feminine. First to signal that women were particularly active, but also rejecting the notion that men lead movements. Of course, Occupy Wall Street in the United States, Israel in 2011-2012 had the largest mobilization in the history of Israel. Again, very similar type of movement. There were 500,000 people demonstrating in Moscow in the middle of the authoritarian regime of Putin in 2012. Portugal against the economic crisis. Italy, the socio-political movement of Cinque Stelle, 5 stars, transformed the Italian political landscape in 2011 and still is there and still is the second largest party in Italy now. Yo soy el 132 in Mexico. I am the 132nd in Mexico during the 2012 presidential campaign, is still very active today. Movements all over Latin America. The Turkish protest that started on the defense of Gezi Park in Istanbul in 2013, and the massive youth demonstrations, and not only youth, in dozens of Brazilian cities, starting in June 2013 and going all the way until now, including the massive protest against the World Cup. Can you imagine the Brazilians protesting against the World Cup? And it's not because they were going to lose. They thought they were going to win. But because of the corruption of FIFA, the corruption of the local and state authorities, and the iniquity of spending so much money for the show and for the business of sports, not for sport, for the business of sports, instead of catering to the social needs of the country. One of the main slogans of the movement was, "We exchange 10 stadiums for 1 hospital," and so on and so on. even the whole movement in Ukraine started as a social movement of this type in the occupation of Independence Square in Kiev, although it was changed, was manipulated, and ultimately became a right-wing, even paramilitary movement at one point. That, by the way, is something that I want to emphasize. Social movements per se are levers of social change, are decisive actors of social change, but they are not always nice. They can be very nasty and look for values that we don't like. So we have to be agnostic as researchers, and not because people mobilize, they are right. No, depends. But what they actually are always are major agents of social change in whatever direction this social change goes. And we should be careful about not being normative in the matter. As I speak, in many other societies, continue to be these kind of movements. So, first of all, empirically speaking, there is a recognition of a major social actor emerging throughout the world. Second, are we talking about the same? Yes or no? Yes and no. But we are talking about movements that share some fundamental trends that make them part of the same species of social movements. Which trends? And that's what I will try to define. First, in terms of the motives and self-definition, these social movements are ultimately focusing on one major issue. They have many different demands, but no program. They are reactions to start with. They have no program or so many demands that cannot be a program. In the General Assembly of Occupy Wall Street in New York, they ultimately agreed on a program of 385 demands, including the dismantlement of all US military bases abroad. I mean, that's a nice program, but certainly not a feasible political program in the short term. And actually, 1 week later, the General Assembly reversed and added on and subtracted different demands. Why? Because if the movements, as I will say in a moment, don't have a formal organized leadership, but work in a grassroots democracy in terms of General Assemblies, a new General Assembly can change what the other General Assembly did. And therefore, it's not a stable program so all the traditional leftists is shaking with that. It's, what a horrible thing. You don't have a party structure. You don't have formal leaders. You can never trust them because they may change. Once they vote something, they can change the vote. So the entire political establishment, left and right, are in panic in relationship to these movements, and particularly left intellectuals. Left intellectuals are the most critical. Why? Because what is these people who don't need us to guide them? They don't have ideas, they don't have policy, they don't have program, they don't have enough experience. What is what they are doing? They want to change the world. Well, we'll tell them how. So the most critical people around the world of these movements are what they call themselves the organic intellectuals that had been disintermediated and lost the job because people found some ways of connecting to each other through the internet and through interface personal networks, and they are doing it by themselves. And this autonomy is unbearable for all political elites because that cuts down their raison d'etre, the reason for their existence. Now, again, here, of course, my tone shows where I am, but I'm also an intellectual. I'm also whatever intellectual. But as an academic researcher, which I am too, I'm first of all trying to show the empirical issues, the facts that condition the new situation. So there are two major elements in that are common in terms of motivation and in terms of what people mobilize all over, which are common. One is the critique of the extreme social inequality, the 1%. The slogan of the Occupy Wall Street in the United States was we are the 99%. you know what? People say, the 99% statistically cannot be, etc. Then in 2013 was a very interesting book by the French economist Thomas Piketty that analyzed global inequality and the evolution over 2 centuries. And guess what? It's not 1% elite. It's 0.3% that controls 80% of the world's wealth, in particular in terms of asset, which is what counts. And one of the interesting effects of this movement is how the United States self-consciousness about the society with equality of chances, social mobility has been shaken by this movement, to the point that this book, the Thomas Piketty book, which is not a perfect book, of course, no academic book can be the definitive one, but it's a book which is a 700 pages thick political economy book, is #1 bestseller in Amazon in the United States. Why? Because suddenly people who already had gotten the message that the 1% controls your lives, now someone told them, and Newsweek told them, and Time magazine told them, and you know, there is a book that is being discussed as such. Now that trigger was being criticized by the Wall Street, of course, and that triggered the interest for the book. So again, this is going to my point about changes of mentality that then trigger the possibility of receiving messages that before would not have been received. 10 years ago, if someone would tell the American public opinion, unequal society, extreme, 1%, no. But 1,000 occupations over several months changed the way in which people started to perceive their own society. That was the absolutely critical point. And a second one that was even more important, the rejection of the legitimacy of governments and of political parties, universal. Now, in that sense, these movements simply tap on the what we know through comparative surveys. About 72 to 75% of the world citizens do not recognize their government as legitimate, even if they were elected. And that's true not only for the so-called developing countries, but for Europe and for the United States, with the exception of little Scandinavia. And even so, Iceland, which was a very Scandinavian country, led the revolution in Europe by rejecting the alliance between business elites, financial elites, and political elites in their country. And actually, they completely changed the political system, wrote a new constitution, debated over the internet, etc., etc., etc. So these are the two critical things. Rejection of an economic model that leads to increasing concentration of wealth and decreasing possibilities of social mobility, and on the other hand, the rejection of the political elites, of the governments as they are, the system of elections, and of political parties as a form of political organization. Then what they propose instead? Well, they don't propose. They don't say, we have this other model of democracy. Yeah, they do have a model of democracy, which is getting together in the squares on the internet and debating about what to do. Well, one can say it's not a directly practical model of democracy for the time being. We'll see, because the internet changes many things in that sense in terms of the possibility of connecting and deliberating. But the notion was not mobilizing for a new model of democracy, was to mobilize against the perceived consequences of this supposed model of democracy that in fact is not democratic. That's what people were saying. They do not represent us. That was the slogan everywhere was, they do not represent us. Therefore, you all go, and then we will find out something else. They don't say we have the solution. They say we will find out something else by talking among us. In the Spanish slogan, there was this notion of we are slow because we go far. So don't pressure us. We are creating a new system, a new something, and we have to do it in a democratic way with one fundamental idea. The way you enact social change determines the outcome of social change. It's the material production of a new form of democracy is how you go about the creation of this democracy. It's not the ideas, it's the material process of production of new social institutions. So, which are the key factors, the key features that characterize all of these movements? First, they are network. That's why I call them networks. They are network in multiple forms. They are certainly network over the internet, and they are certainly network in terms of mobile communication network, which are decisive. But not only. They are based on face-to-face social networks. They are often organized in pre-existing face-to-face physical social networks in the city. For instance, in the case of the Arab countries, was very important the soccer fan clubs, which were social networks. They were very important the networks, both established and spontaneous, around the mosque and the Friday prayer in the mosque. That was extremely important, and the network that would form physically there, and then an interaction with the internet networks. That's the difference. It's not isolated face-to-face networks. It's face-to-face networks which are connected over the internet and which are constantly able to mobilize, to interact, to take initiative on the basis of mobile communication networks. So then there are networks, but the networking is multimodal. Because they are networks, they do not, in any case, an identifiable center. There is no command and control center. There are no central conspiracy systems. They ensure coordination functions and deliberation by interaction between multiple nodes. They do not need a formal leadership or a command and control center because they can co-manage constantly throughout the internet. So they do not have a vertical organization. That makes them, for instance, very capable of resisting repression, because repression is always based on rounding the usual suspects, as the famous movie said, round the usual suspects. Well, there are no usual suspects. There are unusual non-suspects, because nobody knows. So as soon as there is one leader, the leader is immediately picked up. But if they don't know who the leaders are, for the simple reason, not that they are very clandestine, but there are no leaders, then it's a problem. And how the movement ensures that there are no leaders? Simply by not following the instructions or the words of any leader. Anyone who declares himself or herself leader stops being leader. No one pays attention. Again, I'm describing, I'm not saying this is the new model of revolution. No. I'm simply saying what has happened throughout all this movement, through ethnographic, empirical work, and now, and very powerful survey research work. There is in the United States, there is a network called Occupy Research, which has very good surveys, quantitative statistical analysis of all these things I'm saying. And in my institute in Barcelona, there's also another group which is actually doing quantitative statistical research with simulation models and all the stuff you want, with different concepts and different statistical tools. But even if they are network, and even internet is absolutely essential, they truly become movements by occupying urban space in all cases. And in some cases occupying buildings, some cases occupying squares, some cases demonstrating in the street. Why? Because then become visible, and then anyone who wants to join the movement throughout society, simply by going into that encampment or joining the demonstration, becomes part of the movement. No ID card to be member of the Revolutionary Party. No affiliation. They just, you go or you don't go. You are here, you are not here. This is in fact a whole very established historical tradition, the famous barricades of all historical revolutions. The barricades were never a defense tool. On the contrary, they became a target. As soon as you have a barricade, they shoot at you exactly there. But they became a symbolic space, always, of in and out. You are with the movement, you are inside. You are not with the movement, you are outside. And so this marking of the space, which I call the construction of the space of autonomy, is a fundamental characteristic of all movements. It's a space of autonomy that is built on autonomous networks of interaction in the internet, autonomous urban space occupied in different ways, and then the constant interaction between the occupied physical space and the autonomous space in the internet. That's what I call the space of autonomy, a new form of spatial expression of social movements, which always has existed in social movement, but has a new characteristic now in the age of the internet. These movements are also, in all cases, local and global at the same time. They start locally, they diffuse globally. They are constantly in interaction. They are, let's say, in Barcelona, the first occupation gave themselves the name of Tahrir Square. In New York, the first occupation called themselves Puerta del Sol, which was the Spanish first occupation, and so on and so on. Movements refer to each other constantly. They are not organized by any form of new international. People don't travel to conspire. Well, some do revolutionary tourism, but basically it's not a new form of revolutionary international. What they do is they follow in the internet everything that happens. They are constantly aware of everything that happens in the world. There are maps evolving. There are manifestos being diffused. There's a constant deliberation. Then and now. I'm not talking in the past. I'm not talking in the past. Spain continues to be the same. In the United States, the movement has been so heavily repressed, that is now somewhat subdued, but is still there and is still breathing. Why? Because when they are submitted to a strong repression, they withdraw into cyberspace. But they exist in the internet, and they cannot be reached there. They can be surveilled, but surveil and control is not the same thing. Of course, NSA knows everything about these movements, everything. But then they still have to stop the communication, and this they cannot, for a number of reasons, both legal and social and technological. In fact, the movements are heavily protected by the world community of hackers, which creates firewalls that they are very difficult to penetrate, that any moment that the internet connection is interrupted, like in Egypt for 5 days, there is a network of hacker communities around the world that restore the communication within and inside the country. And in some cases, interestingly enough, they are supported by multinational internet corporations like Google. Why Google would be in the world revolution? Well, because it's traffic, and what they care is about business. So if business is for revolution or counter-revolution, it's okay. The important thing that everybody has to go through the internet because they control the internet. So they cannot be against freedom in the internet. Of course, if the US government or any government asks them the data, they give them the data, no question. But forbidding free communication on the internet is a bad business model because that's what their business model is all about. Important characteristic, all the movements are viral. They follow the logic of the internet networks. And it's critical. Seeing and listening to the protests somewhere else, seeing at the police brutality, seeing what happens with the people, seeing the joy of many of these people and the drama of others. This is viral. This is emotionally connected and triggers movements somewhere else. There's a wonderful study by Karine Nahon from the University of Washington that's called Going Viral, which she analyzed zillions of tweets on different social movements, and she shows the virality is the most important characteristic of these social movements because accelerate the speed of change everywhere. Of course, virality has always been important in the history of social movements. The pamphlet circulated, that's why the printing press was fundamental. But this virality now is interactive, is instantaneous, and therefore accelerates the process. Now, the form of organization is clearly based on horizontal networking and communal interaction. The moment these movements try to be organized, cease to be social movements and are transformed into forms of political parties or political agents, which on the one hand increase sometimes, not always, their effectiveness in institutional change, but diminishes the capacity to attract the population at large who are not necessarily in agreement with certain political programs. They are also, in all cases, highly self-reflective movements, highly self-reflective. They are constantly asking themselves who we are, what do we want, what is this new form of movement? In very sophisticated, long discussions in the assemblies they have. I observed in Madrid and Barcelona, no, in Barcelona this was the case, a huge discussion for 2 hours in the General Assembly about the applicability or not of Heidegger theory to the movement. Heidegger, because that shows also a certain level of college education. Well, but you know, Spain, 25% of people are in college, so it's not totally exceptional. But the notion is that it's not simply political activism. Is let's rethink the whole thing, the whole society, and this is everywhere. This is not just in Spain. Now, something absolutely critical. In their origin, they are non-violent movements. They are not violent movements. And in fact, they become more legitimate the more they are attacked by police forces, by repression, etc. Because the image is immediately prompt solidarity from other movements. However, given at one point, the interest of all political systems is to make them violent. The moment they become violent, they lose legitimacy or they transform their nature. That was particularly dramatic in the case of some of the Arab countries, and particularly of Syria. Remember that Syria, the movement started absolutely as a peaceful movement against the brutality of Assad regime when they tortured 12 teenagers who were doing graffiti against the regime, and then the parents went to rescue them, then they killed the parents, then people went in solidarity, then they killed the people who came in solidarity, and at that point was an explosion in Syria in 2011 and 12, and for 6 months there were demonstrations all over Syria, peaceful demonstrations. 10,000 people, 10,000 demonstrators were killed. And at one point, people started to shoot. And at that moment, all the geopolitical interests in the world came upon Syria. They give weapons to one, gave weapons to another. The United States and France armed some, together with Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Then, on the other hand, Iran and Russia supported Assad. Then Al-Qaeda came in and decided that was a great moment to do their own thing. And what was a social movement became an atrocious multilateral civil war. And the first victim of any civil war is a social movement. There's no more social movement. At that point is the logic of violence, the logic of destruction, the logic of annihilation of the enemy. So the interest of systems is to create violence in order to persist, because then the normal citizens, the citizens who want to change but they are not necessarily ready to die, then withdraw. Now, ultimately, these movements are political and not political, as I said. They don't have a program, they don't go for election, but they are very political in the sense that they imagine a new form of political representation and deliberation in some sort of utopian network communal democracy. Over the internet, in open space, in assemblies, etc. So, utopian. Now, by saying utopian, we don't mean that it's nothing. Utopia is not an impossible thing. Utopia is a material force, because utopia exists in the minds of the people. And all major political ideologies and processes of transformation have started as utopias. Liberalism, socialism, communism, they all start as utopias. And they are material forces because they move people towards something which is not necessarily what's going to happen, but is an expression of a blueprint of a different form of social and political organization that people have at heart. So, they believe in the possibility of something else that would not be the kind of rotten, corrupt democracy that people think is the democracy they have, started to create new forms of political representation and new political projects. But then, And all this is still going on. All the movements are, I mean, Brazil has continued throughout the World Cup, and Turkey has a new round of movements, and Mexico, and Colombia, and Uruguay, anyway. Then what is ultimately the result of all this? Well, first of all, history is too recent. We don't know. There's still a process, still coming on. Then there are two different immediate comments on the question of the so what, from the movement and from my own perspective. From the movement, there's a debate about, so finally we do what? Many people in the movement say, that's not the question. That's a productivist logic that is ultimately a capitalist logic, because the notion is not, what are you going to, what is the yield of your investment and in which term? We'll see. We are discussing. We don't necessarily have to be productive right now. We have to change many things. We are in the process of. So the process is more important than the outcome. And the productivist logic is already a logic that implies being subdued to the logic of the dominant system. I'm not saying necessarily that's correct. I'm saying what this is an important debate in the movement. My own take on that is that all social movements ultimately fade away. It's my very romantic theory of social movements. They always disappear. The problem is what happens in the process of disappearance. How productive historically they are in their fading away. How much of what they hope to accomplish or what they fight against becomes seeds of change in the institution, in people's mind. That is the critical thing. Not necessarily, because they are either defeated, repressed, killed, or they are co-opted, integrated, etc. So ultimately, social movements fade away. But what happens in their fading away, this is the really critical question. And what happened there? Well, what I would say that there had been a number of fundamental institutional changes in the world directly linked to these social movements, starting, of course, with the Arab world. Then we can say, no, we don't like it. But change has happened. New institutions have happened. And they're still not close in the process. Egypt has gone through several revolutions, military coup, another revolution, now currently is opposition against the military regime that expelled the Muslim Brotherhood from power. Again, Libya has changed. Syria is in a tragedy, but it's a process of whatever transformation, ultimately. So my point is that institutional impacts had happened on a very major, powerful scale. The positive or negative, which is a normative argument, depends on the specific situations in the specific countries, and particularly the interaction with the geopolitical instruments which are trying to use the movement for their own purposes. Many specific demands in many different situations had been achieved, although this was not the most important thing for the movement, but the specific demands on legislation, on housing, on health, on the budget, the participatory budget in many countries like Brazil. All this has really happened. But again, this would be demand movement, not social movement, so this is a byproduct of the social movement. There had been a number of political impacts, although political impacts in the short term for many of these movements are extremely difficult to accomplish because the political elites in general throughout the world have totally opposed and resisted the demands of this movement. They are ready for some concessions in terms of economic demands, social policy, etc., but not to the fundamental demand of the movement, which is a new form of political representation. Why? Because they are personally concerned. The political elites can accept many things except to accept the notion that they are not the political elite. That's to commit political suicide. And therefore, their enemies, their absolute enemies, are these movements who challenge their legitimacy, who challenge their representativeness. And therefore, the movements are confronted to a very serious situation. If you are not in the institutions, you are going to face the police. That's what the political elites tell them. Either you accept the rules of the game in democracy, or we send you the police. And since the movements are not violent, well, sometimes some people throw some stones, but basically none of these movements, except in the Arab countries, for the reasons I mentioned, are ready for violence at all. In fact, they try to control some of the violent fractions inside the movement. Therefore, by force they cannot do it, by institution they cannot do it, so the hope of the political elites, they will be exhausted. Well, they are not. They are not. First, although they are not youth movements by any means, they have different, they have much lower average age. So first they have time. And second, they don't calculate. They say, well, we cannot take the current situation. We are going to fight as long as we take. And more important, they are, because they remain connected in the internet, they can mobilize and activate on any scandalous situation, on any outrage that is created in society. But with all this, there are a number of political changes that start to happen in different societies as a direct or second-order consequence of the action of the movement. Most interesting and important case is Brazil, in which after 2013, the president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, from the left-wing Workers' Party, actually sided with the movement against the political class, including her own political party. And the historic leader of the party, Lula, also sided with the movement in some kind of paternalistic, patronizing way, saying, well, you are right, basically. Well, of course, these kids, but you are right, and we should change things, and we are going to. And the entire political class in Brazil insurged against the president of Brazil last year, saying, you cannot do that, this is totally demagogic, because she accepted the notion of revamping the political system and has engaged in a project of changing the Constitution, amending the Constitution in fundamental ways, having a new Constitution in which the power of the political parties would be curtailed and in which measures against corruption would be much stronger and implemented. She started the whole campaign, and in addition, all the concrete demands about transportation, housing, health, etc., she accepted. Never enough, never enough. And so the movement said, well, when the World Cup comes, we are going to attack again. And they did, and they got more demands obtained and more sympathy. Now, presidential elections are coming in Brazil, and the interesting thing is that there is still, Dilma Rousseff probably will be reelected, but the main challenge comes not from the right, which is in complete disarray, but from some sort of not left, but something else, which is Marina Silva, who is an Amazonian leader who created a new party called Citizens Network, which is entirely supporting the demands of the movement. And in the polls is very close to the Workers' Party. So not necessarily she's going to win, but this is an element there. Or there are a number of state governments and local governments in Brazil who have adopted some of the democratic rules. For instance, Rio Grande do Sul, the governor Tarso Genro, who is a fan of democracy, the internet, etc., has created a participatory budget we created for Porto Alegre, but did something else now, is budget for the state of Rio Grande do Sul, which is a bigger state, is being debated and decided, this time decided, by citizens over the internet. So there are experiments coming here and there. Other examples in Michelle Bachelet in Chile, when she was elected president, was elected on a program of accepting the large majority of the demands of the student movement that for 2.5 years have occupied the streets of Chile. And she is implementing that. In this case, the movement has been to some extent institutionalized, but in exchange of many of the demands being included against the political class, including the political class of the Socialist Party. In Italy, the five-star movement is not exactly following the model that I presented to you in terms of the movement, because as a leader, as a charismatic leader who is in complete control of the entire movement. But coming from nowhere, he became the largest party in the 2013 parliamentary election. Then the Social Democratic Party now regained power and control, and now this party, Cinque Stelle, is only the second party, but it's the second largest party of Italy, displacing Berlusconi, and coming from nowhere. And what is the program of this new party, which has such a success in Italy? To disband the Italian parliament and replace it by internet deliberation. Crazy, right? Except that 27% of the Italian people think they are not crazy. And of course, going out of the European Union, dropping the euro, and all these things. Cutting off 75% of the salary of the politicians and bureaucrats, and creating a fund for small companies, for small enterprises with this money. So all completely concrete but unrealistic proposals. Let's say that. They are very concrete but totally unrealistic. So it's a symptom. Again, it's a symptom. In the European elections last month, there has been an explosion all over Europe of anti-establishment voting. Most of it in countries that do not have movement, like France. No movement in France at all, because the French throughout history have been the state. So they are political, not social, the state. They continue to be so. So no social movement in France. The last one, I was there, I was May 68. But since then, not much. But this time, the reaction in France, in the UK, etc., went, as you well know, for anti-establishment right-wing parties. Front National in France, the UKIP in the United States, which became the #1 party. So in other words, the traditional established politics is going down. The replacement of these politics depends on the strength or not the strength of movements and the ability to channel the right-wing forces through populist reactions. In the case of Spain, has been different. In the case of Spain, the movement, for the first time after a long debate, accepted some political expression. And the political expression reached the 12% of the votes, against all surprise, with one major party and 3 other different parties. And this has is changing the Spanish political landscape. Conservative parties going down, the Socialist Party is disintegrating, literally disintegrating. So the 2 major parties know that their days are counted for the next election. And the alternatives are bubbling and not there yet. But already the different left-wing and movement organizations already at the level of the political vote are larger than the Socialist Party, that were the traditionally important Socialist Party in Spain. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm saying that 3 years after the movement that everybody say, yeah, but it's not realistic, this will never have political expression, does have a political expression. Same thing in Greece. Largest party in Greece now comes from the movement. And so on and so on. And we could go into the casuistics of many. My main point is not to go state by state or government by government. My main point is that there has been a total crisis on legitimacy of the established political institutions throughout the world, has been a total crisis of the confidence of people in the system in terms of improving their chances of a good life, and therefore, because they did not have expression of the demands and new values in the existing institutions, they are bypassing the existing political system and creating new tools of citizen participation and citizen democracy. So ultimately, social movements do not take control of societies, do not make policies, but social movements change the values of societies that ultimately change the institutions, that ultimately change our lives. That's my current research, and I will continue to go on in the coming years. Thank you for your attention.